Is eating less and burning more really the answer? Most people are pointing to the first law of thermodynamics when they say this. And that law states that the total energy in an isolated system is constant. So what goes in must come out in some form. But the human body isn't an isolated system in this sense. It's far more complex than that. So energy in and energy out are actually dependent on each other in the human body. So if we decrease the amount we take in through food, this actually leads to a decrease in calorie burn, and you don't have any control over that. And as you lose weight, you also decrease your metabolic rate. You have less mass to move around. Again, this is beyond your control. And decreased intake leads to decreased amount of heat generated from digesting food. So if you're taking in less, you're burning less in digesting. Again, beyond your control. You don't have any control over how much heat is generated from the foods you consume, to a sense. We'll come back to that. As you increase your calorie burn through exercise or daily activity, this actually leads to an increase in appetite. So you burn more, but you end up having to eat more because you're more hungry. Again, that appetite is somewhat beyond your control. Now, different foods do generate different amounts of heat in the process of digestion. This is referred to as diet-induced thermogenesis. Protein actually generates the most amount of heat, the most amount of thermogenesis. Now, different foods also undergo different types of digestion. For instance, MCT oil gets shunted directly to energy with very little digestive interaction. So it doesn't necessarily generate a lot of heat directly, but it also doesn't often become a storage type of fat. Increased carbohydrates lead to increased insulin rates. Insulin leads to decreased body fat breakdown for energy and increased energy conversion to fat and a decreased metabolic rate with an increased appetite. So you eat more carbs, you get more insulin. Insulin inhibits fat breakdown and generates more fat storage from all food sources. It decreases your metabolic rate and increases your appetite. The most current issue of the Journal of Nutrition published a meta-analysis of 29 studies. So basically they took 29 different studies that involved 617 people. They collated all the data and analyzed it as a brand new study. And they found that even in an isocaloric state, so all the people participating were eating the same amount of calories, and they were eating the same amount of protein, so no change in protein, but they varied the levels of carbohydrates and fat. So sometimes it was a high carb, low fat, and sometimes it was a high fat, low carb. And they were analyzing which generated more total energy expenditure. So how much energy was actually burned simply by changing the amount of carbs or the amount of fat. And what they found is over the short term, the higher carb diets burned slightly more calories than the low carb eaters did. But this was actually not even a statistically significant difference in calorie burn. In contrast, if you took these diets over the long term, so longer than a couple days, really longer than 2.5 weeks, it dramatically increased the amount of calories they were burning on the high fat diet, low carbohydrate diet. So over time, as the body's adjusted to lower carb eating, it actually resulted in more calorie burn, still in an isocaloric standpoint. So they're still eating the same total amount of calories, but more of the calories are from fat and less are from carbs. and they were burning more total energy. So the moral of this story is that protein burns the highest amount of energy just in digesting it. It has the highest rate of diet-induced thermogenesis. Lower carb eating over time increases the amount of total energy expenditure, but it takes a little bit of time. So you can't just do a weekend of lower carb eating and expect your energy expenditure to be higher. It takes about 2.5 weeks for the average person to start burning more in a low carb state. But again, that comes back to, we don't want to be on a diet anyway. We want to instill a lifestyle. So lifestyles are long-term. So we can't just look at a couple of days and make a determination on the best diet to follow. Most of the studies out there, if you really look at them, only evaluate diets for like 4 days. That's not very effective to determine what the long-term ramifications are when you only look at a couple days. So these studies show that over the long term, lower carb eating, higher fat eating are better for total energy expenditure.